One of the highlights of this year's British Film Festival, run by Palace Cinemas in Australia, is a film called And Mrs. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of And Mrs., who is Australian, uh, Daniel Reisinger. Daniel, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you, Peter. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for talking to me.
Pleasure. And Daniel, you have such an interesting history with Drunk History, and with Sideswiped and with other TV. How did this first feature film come about for you?
Um, well, Peter, I just finished making Sideswiped, which did really well in the States, had 55 million views, great reviews. It had people like Jason Sudeikis, aka Ted Lasso, and uh, Peter Gallagher, people might remember from the OC, or Chris McDonald, who's in Hacks and is Emmy nominated and five times Emmy. Yeah, so we had a whole bunch of great actors in it. I was riding high. I was living in LA, uh, and I got you know, this is a comedy, so bear with me. But I got the worst phone call of my entire life, um, which was my mum calling to tell me that she had a rare form of dementia called FTD, which Bruce Willis is the most famous sufferer of. Um, and sadly, it's at this stage it's still incurable and a bit of a death sentence. Um, and my mum called me and said, I'm scared, and I honestly I just wasn't prepared for it. Uh, and that's life for you, right? Like you know, you're riding high, and then reality crashes in. And so for the first time in my life, I brought up as a good Aussie boy, you know, like as the Australian expression goes, that we all tell our boys, have a teaspoon of cement and harden up. I pretty much haven't cried in, I want to say 20 years at that point. And I absolutely was destroyed by that news. And probably a week later, I want to say 2 weeks, something like that, I get a phone call from my best friend in Melbourne. I was living in LA at the time. And she said, Look, I've got a friend who's a screenwriter. She's coming to LA. Would you have brunch with her? So, when you're working in the film industry in LA, there's always an Aussie in town. There's always someone coming through that you've got to entertain. And so I said, okay, sure, why not? And a Melbourne writer called Melissa Bubnich, who lives in London, turns up with two bottles of Prosecco. We proceed to, start drinking at 10 a.m. And I'm thinking, I love this person, as did my wife. And we had a great old brunch. And at the end of the brunch, she said, Hey, I've got a feature script. Would you read it for me? And, rather patronizingly, I thought, oh yeah, I'll read your script for you. I'll give you some notes. And that night I sat down at about 10 at night to read this script. And I'm going to do a massive spoiler, but it's only the first 5 minutes. So anyone watching the film, it's okay. It goes on from here, and there's plenty more to it. But it starts out as like a classic cheesy rom-com, and in the reality case, what it turns out that it's Aisling Bea, BAFTA winner, star of This Way Up with Sharon Horgan, is about to marry Colin Hanks, aka Tom Hanks' son, aka multi-Emmy nominee for shows like Fargo and Dexter. And it's a cheesy rom-com, and they're about to get married, and then she comes home and he's dead. And it hit me like a truck when I got to page 5. And instead of going to bed, which is the sensible thing to do when you've got young children, and I had a 6-month-old at the time, I stayed up and I read the whole thing, and I bawled my eyes out and I laughed my ass off. Um, and I called Melissa the next day and, hung out with her again. And again, rather patronizingly went, Oh, look, I'd love to produce this for you and help you get it made. And she's like, Oh, that's so sweet of you. But Ashar Tala is producing, and Dan Hine, and you don't know who they are. They're, two of the most prolific and awarded producers in the UK. Um, but she said, I'd love to introduce you, and maybe you could try and talk them into giving you a job directing it. And happily, they have terrible taste in directors because they did. They hired me. And thus started a 3-year odyssey that leads me to be on a Zoom call with you, Peter.
Ah,
And here we are today.
what an interesting backstory, and how interesting to hear the process of getting this directing job, because it's really an enjoyable film. And um, did you
Thank
work?
you.
Yeah, did you work with Melissa to reshape the script in any way, or yeah, how did that all work?
Well, so as I mentioned before, like getting that news from mum was obviously devastating, and it led to me, I've always been a comedy director, and comedy is my passion in life and still is. But it led to me wanting to be a little bit more emotional with things and embrace some darker themes. And this film is really an exploration of grief. And my mum passed in January 30th, 2022. Um, and a week later, I got a call from Universal saying the film was greenlit, and I blubbed on the call. I'll embarrass myself. Uh, but it felt, well, I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about it. But it felt like mum was looking out for us and helping to make this film. And um, so that definitely shaped my experience of building the script with Melissa. And Melissa's an incredibly gifted writer, but hasn't had the same relationship with grief. So myself, and then my three leads, Colin Hanks, Aisling B, and Billy Lord, have very personal relationships with grief. Obviously, I just mentioned I lost my mum. Colin, we think of as, Tom Hanks' son. Nothing could go wrong in his life. Had some very deep connections with grief, and had lost a very close friend just prior to filming, and dealt with some grief in his early 20s. Aisling B lost her father and talks very movingly about it in The Guardian, and it's worth reading that article. And then Billy Lord famously lost her mother, Carrie Fisher, aka Princess Leia, and grandmother, Debbie Reynolds, aka Singing in the Rain, within a span of 48 hours. And we all connected with the script because we wanted to say something about grief, and wanted to say not just grief sucks, which is, you know, obvious. But we also wanted to say, hey, it's okay to laugh about grief. Um, I think that was important to all of us. So that was something that we really built into the script, and there's lots of nuances that are in there. Like, Billy talked to me about how the week after Carrie Fisher died, there was this endless stream of people knocking on the door, ringing the doorbell, I should say, with another grief book, and she had a huge pile of them. So we built that into the script. Or, my own experience was I found it really difficult planning a funeral because it's also, I guess, for want of a better word, commercial. And like there's a built into the script a ring binder where you go through and you pick the bloody gravestone and the, the fabric of the cushions, and the quality of the wood. It's so bizarre. So we built all of that into the script. Um, and the premise of the film is that Aisling loses Colin, and she reacts to this grief by deciding that she's going to marry him anyway, marry him
Mm.
posthumously, which seems bizarre, right? Absolutely. What a crazy idea. But the thing is, I partly grew up in France, and in France, it's actually a part of life. You can marry people posthumously. You have to apply to the president, and the film explores that. Um, and you know, I think one of the things that we were all anxious to say is you can grieve however the hell you need to. Whatever you want, whatever you need, that's the way to do it. And no one has a right to you to say you can't marry someone posthumously. I mean, we had the London premiere, and one of the most gratifying experiences of traveling around the world with the film has been we've worked in partnership with grief charities around the world. And I'll never forget in the London premiere, um, there was this woman sitting right in front of me, Charlene, as I now know her, who laughed louder than everyone and cried harder than everyone. And at the end, she stood up and she said, "I just wanted to let you know how much your film meant to me, which is everything you want to hear as a filmmaker." And she told us the story about how her partner had died 4 months previously, and she'd married him posthumously, not posthumously, sorry, 2 weeks before he passed, knowing that he was terminally ill. So, what we're trying to say with this film is number one, it's okay to laugh. Number two, it's weird. Going through grief is super weird, and there are these strange rituals. And that's a universal experience. And number three, it's okay. It puts an arm around your shoulder and goes, we can get through this together, and you do you, as the kids would say. However you need to grieve, that's how you grieve.
Yes, absolutely, and the film definitely demonstrates that, which I was quite impressed by. It's interesting how what is brought up in the film is a law in England about seeking approval to be able to marry posthumously, if you like to put it that way, which I found very interesting. And I loved Harriet Walter as the personification of who decides that.
Dame Harriet is an absolute gem, an absolute gem. And one of the highlights of my life, and I'll never forget it, was crafting a joke when you watch it about faking orgasms with her on the set, and then having her say it. Was a pinch yourself moment. And for people who don't know Dame Harriet, she is a five-time Emmy nominee
Hmm.
for Succession. She's the mum in Succession. She's the Emmy nominee as well for Killing Eve, where she's the chain-smoking Russian instructor. And she's also Emmy nominated for Ted Lasso and Silo. So if the Emmy committee are listening to this, it's time to give her one of those bloody Emmys.
I like that. That's a great shout out. And of course, additionally to that, I'll talk about the leads in a moment. Sinead Cusack and Elizabeth McGovern, having them both in the film was also excellent.
It was, I mean, again, what a life pleasure. Sinead Cusack. And little interesting tidbit, her husband is played by Peter Egan, who himself has a very powerful connection with grief. He lost his wife a year before we started filming. Um, and Peter and Sinead are just electric together. Um, and it wasn't until after we'd cast them and I sat down with them. Obviously I'm an Australian, so I didn't grow up in Britain. Uh, and I was talking to them both together. And I was like, "So, how are we going to establish this?" And they go, "Oh, don't worry about it. We played husband and wife 5 times, and we dated for 5 years in our 20s." So I was like, "Okay, that tick. I will not need to do anything there." And they just have a wonderful chemistry. And then Liz McGovern was an interesting full circle moment because she plays without doing too much of a spoiler, but she plays not the best mother in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the reasons I was so excited about Liz doing this is in I'm gonna you probably have this better than me, Peter, but I want to say 79 Ordinary People by Robert Redford um, was released, and Mary Tyler Moore got an Oscar win for that film, and in it, America's sweetheart Mary Tyler Moore played a horrible mother, and Timothy Hutton's girlfriend in that film was Elizabeth McGovern. Um, so to me, it was kind of a kick having, everyone's favorite character in Downton Abbey, who's so sweet and he's the only nice person in that show, um, playing quite a nasty person. And she brought so much to that role. It was incredible.
Yes. Oh, the casting is excellent, and Colin Hanks, for example, he's very good. It's interesting how he is in the film in flashbacks and as a sort of ghostly figure, almost like a truly, madly, deeply sort of approach. But he's very good,
That was
and
a big reference. That was one I watched.
ah,
I watched a few times just to kind of think about that ghostly presence. And actually, one of the things that I came away with from watching Truly Madly Deeply is what I didn't want to do. It's a masterpiece. Don't get me wrong. And Anthony Minghella did an incredible job of directing it. And Alan Rickman, who is or was, I should say, Harriet Walter's best friend, um, is incredible in it. But I came away going, okay, I don't want to do that. He's an interventionist ghost. I wanted to try and make it clear that this is a figment of her imagination rather than a real ghost, so to speak. I don't know
yes.
if that came across, but it doesn't matter. If you think he's a ghost, then by all means.
No, no, that's fine. That's fine. It's probably just a shorthand way of describing how he appears
Mm.
in the film, but that's fine. And look, Aisling B, I hadn't heard a great deal about her apart from seeing her on 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
But she's so
She's a
good.
household name in Britain.
Aha.
Yeah. BAFTA winner. She did an incredible show, if you haven't seen it yet, called This Way Up with Sharon Horgan, where they play sisters that Aisling wrote. And look, I can honestly say she's the best actor I've ever worked with, and I've got, a fair few, as I've mentioned on this call already, amazing actors who I've been privileged enough to work with. But Aisling, just the dramatic reach that she has, as well as the comedy chops. I mean, she can just make. I always think the real mark of comedy isn't saying a great joke and making people laugh. It's being able to do a thing that on paper, when you write it, is not funny. And you're like, that is hysterical. There's a moment where she shushes someone in the film, and every time she does it, I die. I think she's a comic genius as well as a dramatic one too.
Yes, yes. No, they're all excellent. I must say also your use of locations in London was particularly interesting and just very natural. I thought you found some really nice spots.
Well, credit where credit's due. Melissa wrote those into the script. Melissa, so when you watch the film, Ashling's apartment, uh, at least the exterior of the apartment when they're sitting over the canals there, that's Melissa's apartment. And that's across the road from Victoria Park. So we had a base very close to Melissa's apartment. We had a rule that if you had to go more than 1.5 Ks from our base, then it wasn't allowed. So there's only two locations in the entire film that are more than. It's all based in Hackney, except for obviously Westminster. Um, you can't fake Westminster to be anywhere else but Westminster, and yeah, the house that they go to in the deep dark woods. So I won't spoil. Yeah, so that's definitely Melissa's contribution.
Oh, excellent stuff. And I must say the Partridge Family gets a look in as well.
Yes, I mean the Partridge Family. There's an interesting story there, Peter, which is that we up until very shortly before filming, that was Rick Astley's "Never Gonna Give You Up." Was supposed to be the song. And I mentioned before that I worked with Jason Sudeikis, aka Ted Lasso, on my show, and unfortunately he couldn't make the dates work. Um, uh, But I get a call one day from Ashling, and she's like, "Have you watched the latest episode of Ted Lasso?" I was like, "No," and she goes, "They've got Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up in it," and we were horrified because we thought it was the most perfect song ever. But in hindsight, it turned out to be this huge blessing in disguise because the Partridge Family, as you said, is integrally woven into the film and just gave it a whole other dimension, that we didn't have before.
Yes, absolutely does. No, it's a really enjoyable film, and I like the way. Of course, we won't spoil it. The last 15, 20 minutes of the film, there are a number of twists and turns that happen, which I thought was also really quite delightful in terms of
Oh, it's nice of you to say.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges with this film, Peter, is it seemed to me like with grief, the obvious way to do a film like this is just make it very, very grounded, very straight, very Fleabag. And but every film that I was out there that I was researching, they all seemed to be made the same way. So seeing as everyone was digging, we thought it'll be more interesting to zag. So our biggest touchstone was Muriel's wedding, tonally, which is 30 years old
yeah,
this year. Can you believe it?
yeah,
It's crazy. But the thing with Muriel's wedding, which I think is so unique that PJ Hogan did so wonderfully, is it's very broad, right? It's very broad, which makes it very accessible, right? But then in a heartbeat, it goes from super broad to super emotional. Like for example, the scene where Tony Collette's character, when Muriel first sees a Willie, and she's laughing hysterically, and she's so amazing in that moment. And then Rachel Griffiths collapses to the floor, and she's paralyzed for the rest of her life. And to me, I thought that is a wonderful challenge, and not just a wonderful challenge, but it's a way to make grief accessible to people, to make it not just a yet another very dark film that explores grief. I wanted to be truthful to the experience of grief while, you know, giving people a happy time, a fun time and a rollicking ride. So, yeah, hopefully we've succeeded in that. And the reviews have been amazing, and it's just been so gratifying traveling around the world watching it with people. And I'm so beyond excited that Palace have picked it up to play in Australia. And I can't wait to see how an Australian audience reacts. Not least actually that Palace have picked it up because my mum and I, our tradition was we would go to the Norton Street Leichhardt Palace Cinema here in Sydney. That was our tradition. We'd have a pasta and we'd go watch some obscure European film that have way too much sex in it, and I'd feel awkward sitting next to my mum, going, "Oh my God, what am I doing here?"
Okay, how interesting to hear all that. Well, you're going to be at a few Q&As as part of the British Film Festival, I think,
That's
from
right.
yeah, which is excellent, which is happening during November across Australia, which is great to
Yes,
see.
so it's November 7th in Melbourne. I want to say November 13th in Brisbane. I'm not 100% on that one, sorry. And then November 19th at the Central Cinema here in Sydney.
Okay, all very good. I'm sure audiences will respond very well. And Daniel, I must ask you, are you working on another film at the moment?
Well, as a director, there's always a lot bubbling away that I'm very excited about. I've just been in Seattle shooting a documentary series based on an amazing book called The Rejects, which is about the people fired from the biggest bands of all time. And we just went and shot with a gentleman called Jason Everman, whose story beggars belief. He was in Nirvana, which was the biggest band of the early 90s, only for them to sack him. And he went to Soundgarden, who were probably the second biggest band of the early 90s, only for them to sack him. Uh, And then he found his true calling in life and became a special forces soldier and was one of the first troops into Afghanistan. So yeah, it's a very exciting show. Beyond excited about it.
Quite a story.
Bit
Looking
of a
forward.
departure from comedy.
It is, but also you do a variety of things I've noticed. So which is great. That documentary you're working on sounds great. So excellent stuff. And we certainly recommend that people go and see And Mrs., which is part of the British Film Festival in Australia, Palace Cinemas, and we've been speaking to the director of And Mrs., Daniel Reisinger. Daniel, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you very much, Peter. And if you love rom-coms and like weird twists on them, this is please get out and support Australian film. So thank you very much.
Fair comment. All the best, Daniel. Hope it all goes well.
Cheers. Thanks, Peter.
Bye bye.